We think that the biggest impact that the state of Utah can have on the world is not necessarily by closing down our power plants or addressing emissions here at home, but by generating the technologies that will be deployed globally.
This week on the County Seat, we will take a step back from the politics surrounding coal-fired power to look at how technology is creating a second life for carbon-based fuels. The County Seat is next.
The future cannot be predicted, but futures can be invented. Thank you for tuning in this week to the County Seat. I'm Derek Dowsett, filling in for Chad Booth. This week we're going to explore technologies being built here in Utah that promise to invent a new future for utilizing carbon. Carbon is often referred to as the king of elements because of the many compounds it can form. It is that chemical diversity that may serve as a solution for mitigating tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the future. We will talk about two technologies, one for capturing and another for utilizing carbon later in the show. First, we will start off with a look at a unique coal mine in southern Utah and its impacts on the local economies and reclamation taking place on site. You can't talk about carbon without first talking about coal.
In terms of energy, it's the most abundant fuel source on the planet. Coal still is, and it still will be for a long time.
Coal fuels more than half of the electricity generated in the state, and a quarter nationwide. And while a number of coal-fired power plants are projected to convert to natural gas domestically, coal still represents an important natural resource for rural Utah. 2.5 miles south of the town of Alton is the Coal Hollow Mine, a mine that has been in production since 2011 on private ground, but has recently received approval to mine coal on a federal lease. Annual production at the site has ranged from 488,000 to 724,000 short tons of coal, with an expectation of ramping up production to 1 million short tons of coal on the federal lease. To get a better idea of what that means, Utah produces 13.6 million short tons of coal per year. Nationally, that number is 756 million short tons of coal. While these numbers may appear small at the national level, they represent an important economic driver for communities surrounding Alton.
It provides a career opportunity for people that actually grow up in these communities. This is a job where you can come straight out of high school, start operating equipment, and you can actually make a career out of this, which is mostly unheard of in a lot of rural communities. Then there's also the indirect economic benefit of all the money that those employees spend. But then you also have the relationships that we have with local vendors. As much as possible, we try to source our materials and supplies locally. And so we have our equipment suppliers. So you have parts and maintenance labor and everything else that we have to use. You have welding suppliers. You have all the consumables that we go through, whether that's steel parts for the equipment or whether that's blasting and those types of materials. As you can imagine, a large amount of diesel fuel. So we have a lot of indirect benefit to these local economies because of that. So while we might only directly employ 30 to 40 employees at any given time, typically we expect to be indirectly employing over 200 to 300 people through the different trucking companies and the different vendors that we work with.
The economic impact extends all the way from the mine to the Intermountain Power Plant, 177 miles away near Delta, and then onward as the majority of that electricity generated is distributed to the largest municipal utility in the country, in Southern California. 1,500 jobs are tied to Utah's coal mining industry. 7 out of Utah's 29 counties are considered heavily dependent on coal. A fact that is easily overlooked because there is a disconnect between the Wasatch Front, where we benefit from those resources that come from smaller places like Alton. While the extraction of coal is the purpose of the mine, there is as much attention paid to how the site will look after the mine here at Coal Hollow.
Well, that begins right from the very get-go when we're starting our permitting. You know, all these seed mixes and the final topography, everything is planned in the permitting process. And it's every day of our mining, we're planning on putting things back together. We're doing concurrent mining, and so everything is how are we going to hit that final mark where we want to be.
We're going straight to reclamation as we mine. So we'll take the overburden off, we'll place it in the spoil behind us, we'll take out the coal, and then as we progress, in this case northward, all that dirt is getting pushed straight back into the hole that we just mined out. And then you fill that final hole in, put soil on top, and then you're planting and starting the clock for the final reclamation.
So this is final reclamation. The reclamation was completed about in 2016. The vegetation that we plant back in here oftentimes comes in much better. It's a better vegetation for the wildlife and for the for livestock, if that's the final use of it.
It's something we take a lot of pride in. I think for a long time the mining industry has gotten a black eye for the practices that they had as far as not cleaning up their mess. But it's something that we actually are very proud of in regards of the work that we do to restore the land to not only as good as it was before we started, but in most cases better than it was before we started.
When we come back, we will follow the coal on its journey from Alton to the Intermountain Power Project just outside Delta to find out what IPP isn't sending up the stack. What is scrubbed from the emissions at a coal-fired power plant sounds more like a Dr. Seuss rhyme than stuff you'd want to end up in the air. The emission controls that were built into IPP were ahead of their time in the 80s and continue to meet environmental regulations to remove the majority of SOx and NOx and ROx.
When you burn coal in a power plant of this type, first you pulverize that coal to a face powder consistency and blow it into the boiler where it's immediately consumed. That creates a couple of different products. The first product is a solid product. It's the non-combustible portion of the coal. It's the rocks and so forth that was mixed in with the coal, basically. That comes out as a solid material, either as fly ash, which wants to fly up the stacks, or bottom ash that drops to the bottom of the boiler. That ash is collected in a couple of ways. The bottom ash is collected at the bottom and sluiced out. The fly ash is captured in a giant building called a bag house that is actually hundreds of multi-story tall vacuum cleaner bags that filter out over 99% of the particulate and collect it. That fly ash actually is a valuable product. Much of the fly ash produced at the Intermountain Generating Station is collected and sold for use in making concrete. And every ton of fly ash that goes into concrete replaces a ton of Portland cement. And not manufacturing that ton of Portland cement saves a ton of CO2 emissions. So this coal-fueled power plant has been offsetting carbon emissions through using this solid fly ash product. In addition to the solid materials that are left over after you burn coal, there are, of course, a number of gaseous materials. One of the primary constituents is NOx, or nitrogen oxides. The power plant actually has equipment and practices within the boiler itself to help reduce the formation of NOx during the combustion of the coal. This consists of both low NOx burners, and also by controlling the conditions under which you can burn the coal, you can reduce those NOx emissions. Another major concern is sulfur emissions. For that, the Intermountain Generating Station has a flue gas desulfurization system, or FGD system, often called a scrubber. This scrubber is another giant building at the back end of the power plant. Basically, the way it works is a limestone slurry, and the exhaust gas from the power plant is bubbled through that slurry, and that removes the sulfur. It also removes mercury and some other constituents.
The plume you see exiting the top of the stack ends up being mostly water vapor, CO2 and any nitrogen oxides or sulfur that weren't captured in the previous steps. While emissions at a coal-fired plant haven't been completely eliminated, it's not from lack of effort.
These emissions control devices are not a small undertaking. The scale of them is actually enormous. When I describe the bag house as being vacuum cleaner bags, what you don't realize is that those vacuum cleaner bags are 10 stories tall and there are over 1,000 of them. The scrubber device similarly is a giant building. Companies that have gone back and retrofitted older plants to install a scrubber will often spend $400 to $800 million just for that device.
The Intermountain Power Plant will be converting from coal to natural gas generation in 2025, which is a story for another day. When we come back, we will discuss two of the biggest challenges to power generation and one Utah company's solution.
We take the carbon out of the ground in the form of coal or natural gas, then we combust it and get energy out of it. This technology doesn't just make a coal-fired power plant less of a problem on the grid, it actually turns a coal-fired power plant into a solution.
Welcome back to the county seat. If you are just joining us, we have been following the path of coal from the ground to the power plant, which has traditionally been the life cycle of that resource. In this next segment, we are going to look at a technology that is being built here in Utah that promises to solve two of the biggest challenges to the generation of electrical power. How do you cut down or eliminate CO2 emissions from coal and gas-fired power generation? And how do we store the power generated by renewables?
This is a technology that addresses both of those issues. It can eliminate, actually reduce to below zero the emissions from a power plant. It can become a net sink of CO2 at a power plant using this technology. And simultaneously, it can provide very efficient, very large-scale energy storage.
In our process, we cool the gas down to the point where the CO2 freezes. Then we turn the gas and the CO2 back around, the cold gas and cold CO2 back around, and warm those back up so that when they're coming out of the plant, they're at about the same temperature as when they went into the plant. And by doing that, we're able to do a lot of energy recovery and energy integration.
Once the carbon dioxide is separated from the air, it can be transported as a liquid to be sequestered back into the ground or used in other applications, such as enhanced oil recovery, curing concrete, and potentially beverage-grade CO2 in your favorite carbonated drink. Another interesting characteristic of the technology is how modular the design is, which helps another challenge for a power plant, the cost of implementing a carbon capture solution.
So in the United States and in the developed world, we're largely at a place where power demand is pretty flat. It might increase a little bit some years, but some years actually recently it's decreased. Especially as we have efficiency improvements, things like LED light bulbs and things like that actually bring down power demand. So we're not in a position where we're building a lot of new power infrastructure in the developed world. And because of that, it's a lot more financially viable to use what we've already built. So an existing power plant can take this technology and strap it on without any modification to the plant and with very limited impact on the plant.
And that's a much, much easier thing to scale and to ship around the world and to globalize than something that requires rebuilding the whole infrastructure that it's attached to. Any technology that wants to address climate change in a meaningful way has to be able to be exported globally. That is, there's nothing that the United States by itself can do that will substantially change the trajectory of the climate. And that's true of just about every country. There's no one country, not even any small group of countries that can by itself address this problem. Partly that's because the world is a big place and there are a lot of emitters around the world, but mostly that's because as we look to the future, the greatest amount of CO2 is going to come from new sources in developing countries. This is a technology that mostly addresses an environmental issue, not a technology that makes somebody money, except for compliance with environmental regulations. And we've had funding from Europe, from the Middle East, from Canada, several places in the United States, both state and federal governments, and all of them have been essential in terms of building this technology, and we wouldn't be anywhere near as far along if we hadn't had that support.
What if a company could transform the carbon it is sending into the air into a valuable product? When we return, we will visit with a company that's working on that very solution.
What we're looking at here are the first generation batch reactors that we used in the basement of our home to validate that the chemical reaction would work. On graduating from university, our son let us know that he joined the Army. This was during the Iraq War. 2007, he deployed to Iraq. That was a time when IEDs were having a devastating impact. Dallas decided he wanted to give better protection to his son by inventing better armor. So he researched how is the best armor in the world made. And it is made from carbon nanotubes, carbon nanofibers. Problem is that material is so expensive, the Army doesn't use it. It's not available in large volume. So Dallas built a lab in our basement, figured out a better way to make it. He used carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, as the feedstock.
That was Gay-Win Quantz, CEO of Solid Carbon Products, sharing another incredible discovery that's been made in utilizing carbon dioxide. We started our program looking at carbon as a solid. Power plants sent it up the stack as a gas. We froze that gas and ended up with a liquid. Now we will talk about taking that carbon dioxide and producing a solid through something called the noise process.
The noise process is where we take a greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, and combine it in the presence of hydrogen and an iron catalyst. It goes into a hot space called the reactor, and in that reactor, those two gases in the presence of the catalyst convert to solid carbon and distilled water. Out the top of the reactor comes the gas with the carbon in it and the moisture of reaction in it. We then separate out the carbon and condense out the distilled water, and that's it. So you start with two gases, they go through a reactor, you end up with carbon and water. Very straightforward. It operates as a continuous closed loop, no emissions. When a company can capture their CO2 using one of the many good CO2 capture technologies out there, and then make money from using that CO2 as feedstock, that's going to change how people view their CO2 emissions.
Taking an obligation and turning it into an opportunity, Solid Carbon Solutions technology offers an alternative to the traditional process for making carbon black.
The carbon black that results in the dye, the black on that frame, the black there, the black of the plastic chairs, or the black of your tire. When you think of the car tires, they're 30% carbon black. Right now in the world, 2018 numbers, there were 13 million tons of carbon black made. The way that carbon black was made was by a controlled combustion of a heavy fraction of oil. So we burn oil currently to make carbon black. That's how the rest of the world does it. What we do here is we take carbon dioxide, a waste stream, and convert it to carbon black. Solid Carbon Products is the only large-scale CO2 utilization technology in existence at this time. I hope that's not the case in another 20 years. But right now, we have an economic, proven ability to convert CO2 into durable carbon. The reaction that is underway in there, we take 3.7 tons of CO2 plus 0.3 tons of hydrogen, and we get 1 ton of carbon and 3 tons of distilled water. What does that actually mean? What it means is that the entire carbon industry, which is over $25 billion a year, can have a technology upgrade because of a small little company in Utah. It means that a coal-fired power plant, instead of emitting the CO2, can have their CO2 scrubbed out of their emissions by a company such as Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. That's a company that is working with Prairie State over in Illinois, a coal-fired plant, to extract their CO2 out of their coal fire emissions. That CO2 can then get run through the noise process and be made into a commercially valuable product and displace how that carbon black is currently being made by burning oil. So we take the CO2, which is inherently released by making power for our community, and we take that CO2 and turn it into carbon, instead of that carbon being made by a process that releases even more CO2. What does this mean for Utah? It means that Utah has the potential to be the global leader in CO2 utilization technology. We can be part of climate impact solution. And it all started with Dallas wanting to keep Matt safe. And it turns out that we have the potential to keep more than just our son safe.
We started the show with a quote from Dennis Gabor, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics back in 1971. He spoke of the future not being able to be predicted, which we certainly cannot. But as you've seen today in today's episode, we may be able to invent it. Think about what energy looked like back in 1971 versus now, and that we have only looked at 2 technologies in today's program, and consider how many other people are out there inventing and working on a brighter and cleaner future. Remember that local government has the most impact on your daily life. Be involved, share this program, and we'll see you next week on the County Seat.
Thank you for watching The County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.